I wanted to talk about two things today. Um, First, I want to start with the new Human Rights Watch report on India that's come out. It's about the protests and attacks that have happened against the Muslim communities since the new citizenship law has come out. And I think it's a great report, and I really urge all of you to read it. But also, if you're a journalist in India, please do look at the report and also report on this report. I think it's absolutely important. The second thing I really wanted to talk about was I saw Rahul Kanwal's reporting today that targeted again went after the Muslim community. And again, he's not the only one doing it. And I thought it was absolutely important to really think about what all of this means. So, what I really wanted to do is walk you through this idea of journalism as genocide and what that really means. And hopefully, many of you would go on to think about these things, but also do things that actually challenge this kind of bigotry and hate. So I'm going to start with talking about what journalism as genocide means. So in 2003, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda said that Rwandan journalists it named three Rwandan journalists as guilty of genocide, incitement to genocide, conspiracy, and crimes against humanity. And the case raised some very, very important questions regarding the role of media and, more crucially, the idea of accountability. When and how does journalists who especially spew hate become accountable for the larger things that they are doing? And since the Nuremberg trials, for the very first time, hate speech was prosecuted as a war crime. And the judgment declared that the way the journalists in Rwanda had acted actually constituted to this idea called journalism as genocide. So what we're really going to think about today is looking at existing material and much that has been written about Rwanda and the Nuremberg trials and former Yugoslavia. For me, what became really interesting, as a young lawyer, I worked for the War Crimes Tribunal for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And as I was going through so much of the material that was there, I came across the Rwandan cultural anthropologist Charles Mironko's work. What Charles Mironko does is he analyzed hundreds and hundreds of confessions of genocide perpetrators. And what his work really confirms, and again, taking from his work, I went and then again looked at the transcripts in the trials of Nuremberg and the trials from Yugoslavia. And what his work confirms is this idea that hate messages in the media has very direct effect on the dehumanization of a population that is subject to consistent slander. And several months of this behavior in the absence of credible reporting and actually conditions the population for hate and, more importantly, to kill. Similarly, the tribunal held that the media, both the case of newspapers and radio in Rwanda, relentlessly targeted the Tutsi population for destruction and portrayed them as a political threat. Not very different from what's happening in India right now. And the hate media essentially became a background score to the state's dispensation of arbitrary authority. And the journalists became both the petty sovereign of the state and useful idiots. You're absolutely right. I am calling Rahul Kanwal a useful idiot. But also don't forget that bigotry is big business. It's not only that these people are inherently bigots who can speak in good English, but they also make money out of hate. People like Rahul Kanwal, Sudhir Chaudhary, Arnab Goswami, and many, many others actually make money. Bigotry is big business, so do not forget that. And this is no different. Again, when the Rwandan tribunal was deciding this case, they went back to Nuremberg trial and the Nuremberg tribunal judgments to kind of make this and equate and understand how what happened in Nazi Germany affected, or how we can take instances of what happened from Nazi Germany and kind of apply those things to Rwanda. And what they really found was that their Stroma, another magazine that was very similar to Kangura in Rwanda, did exact same thing. The Nuremberg Tribunal held that The Nazi newspaper injected into the minds of thousands of Germans poison that caused them to support the National Socialist policy of Jewish persecution and extermination. So what did these both magazines do, both in Rwanda and in Nazi Germany? These stories were filled with stories of slander, libel, smear campaigns, fabricated stories, all in the name of journalism. Journalistic standards, by any journalistic standards, these magazines were absolute trash. But they enjoyed enormous influence and support from leading public figures in various fields. Political elites, popular journalists, all of them actually supported these tabloid newspapers. And that really brings us to this idea is that this is not an exception anymore. This is not the fringe anymore. This is pretty much mainstream across the board. And that kind of brings us to the behavior of the Indian media. The behavior of sections of Indian media, actually no, the behavior of majority of Indian media, the sections is actually the other way. Vast sections of Indian media over the last decade at least, and more so in the last few years, are eerily similar to what journalists and many did in both Nazi Germany and in Rwanda. And again, we've seen this happen over and over again. Gujarat was, what happened in Gujarat was pretty much a precursor to all of this. But in Gujarat, you saw a lot of the regional newspapers doing this. But what we really saw in the last 5 or 6 years is that the national mainstream English media newspaper, which has been dabbling with all of this, is now pretty much front and center. So how does all of this come about? And today I'm just going to do something very quick and talk to you about this idea called democratic alibi. And democratic alibi as a concept can actually help us understand how all of this happened. Again, democratic alibi is this concept that was framed by the French historian Jean-Pierre Chrétien. And how he describes it is this. He uses the word democratic alibi to mean the use of democratic knowledge and language, but that language is designed for totalitarian mobilization and under the guise of freedom of speech. So what does it really mean? I then took this idea of democratic alibi and based on looking at the transcripts from Rwanda, Nuremberg, and Yugoslavia, expanded the definition of democratic alibi. And for me, democratic alibi, again, building on the work, existing work, is looking at how democratic alibi divorces the questions of ethics from the political and employs mechanisms of mass conditioning and mobilization that is required to create hate. The main job of democratic alibi is to use language that seems to be democratic, and yet you use it to create ideas of hate. Again, democratic alibi is absolute precondition for riots, lynchings, political trials, extrajudicial killings, military occupation, and genocidal violence. Its legitimacy lies in justification of collective violence, either by the state or the mob, and it begins by creating a dispensable enemy of the state. It could be your anti-national, the urban Naxal, the secular, the minority, it doesn't matter. But what this really means is that all of this could be applied to anyone simply because the very definition of all of this is so vague. An established pattern of presenting and commenting on the transformations of political debate into this righteous passion against individuals and groups who disagree on the status quo. This is where someone like Arnab Goswami or Sudhir Chaudhary really excel. Their real great strength is sitting in front of you and telling you how they are right and everybody else is wrong. The targets of violence are marked with precision. And this is no different from what the Indian Prime Minister Modi did when he says things like identify people by their clothes, or when Home Minister Amit Shah actually calls people termites. And then once you marked people, what you do, you accuse them of being enemies of the state. Later, you explain what is to be done to the enemy. Surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, just yesterday, the Star of Mysore newspaper referred to Muslims as rotten apples and said that you should get rid of them. And also used the example of both Singapore and Israel. Let's also understand that Israel, for all purposes, is now an ethno-nationalist settler colonial state. and say this is how Israel has done this. Again, you're looking at the violence that the Israeli state perpetrates on Palestinians, and now it demands that India use these exact same playbook to deal with the Muslim problem. Again, I've told that this editorial was withdrawn, but also understand that this is an evening in Karnataka that is circulated quite widely. So once you're done with identifying the enemy, what you're done with them, you constantly keep repeating it. Through constant repetition, you construct a political, moral, and historical alibi that eventually becomes accepted truth. In this steady journey into this abyss of intolerance, journalists and news anchors become agents of the state and in some ways annihilators of the society. All the ingredients for conditioning of democratic alibi that existed in Nazi Germany and Rwanda exists in India today. Now, what happens with all of this? I think at this point in time, we have to understand and accept that the Hindu Rashtra is already here. You keep hearing that we are still having this battle for India's secular democratic soul, but actually in reality, that battle might as well have been lost. Increasingly, what we need to do as citizens is to keep questioning people like Rahul Kanwal. Not only journalists, but our lawyers, our judges, our administrators, our politicians. Our capacity to question is pretty much the last thing that we have left. Second, protect the people and the communities around you. I think what we're really seeing right now is an unprecedented targeting of the Muslim communities in the country. And all of this is going to lead to far more violence. And one of the things I would do is to really just make sure that we educate ourselves with the right kind of information, but also try our level best to make sure that we are in some ways able to protect these communities. Again, I really urge all of you with the capacity to speak, to consistently speak against all kinds of injustice. And that is all the things, it's one of the main things that we can do. Thank you.